Jim, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for making the time.
Happy to do it.
I don't know if you know this, but I heard you speak for the very first time almost 20 years ago in my career when Executive Women's Forum had just started, and you came as a guest speaker. I think you were the only male that was at that conference that year, and I heard you speak, and it was really inspirational, and I've looked up to you and your career ever since then, and so I've always considered you a role model in the industry, and so I remember that was kind of the very start of my career that I've been following you since.
That's exciting, and you deserve it.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start about, I've heard a lot of things about you, I've seen you speak, but I don't actually know how you got your start in cybersecurity. Was it accidental? Was it intentional?
Yeah, I'll give you the short story first and then the longer story. The short story is it was accidental, and Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was a regulatory requirement for financial institutions, and it said you had to have a CISO and you had to have an information security strategy. Now this is going back probably 2002, 03, that time frame. And so I was chosen as the first CISO of American Express because of that requirement, because my boss, the CIO, didn't want to have to deal with the cybersecurity challenge. So that's how I got it. So I was in IT and I got just kind of anointed as the first CISO. So that was the short story. The longer story, I'm in security because of my wife, because I moved my entire family to Minnesota for 3 years. And after the third winter, one night at dinner, Ellen said, look, the kids and I are moving back east. Would you like to come? She wasn't into the winters in Minnesota. So I said, yeah, I think I would, right? So I had to find another job. So I called the CIO who I reported to. I said, look, you got to get me another job. And he said, yeah, come on back. We'll figure out a role for you. And it ended up leading a bunch of econometricians. I didn't know what an econometrician was. I had to look it up in the dictionary. It's basically a statistician. And it turns out that we call them today data scientists. So I basically got a foundation in data science. And I ended up reporting to the chief risk officer. And that's what identified me as a candidate to do cybersecurity, is I had an IT background, I knew the card business really well, and I reported to the chief risk officer. So I owe my security career to my wife, Ellen.
All because she didn't like the cold and you needed to get out of there.
Yes.
I love that story.
Yes.
If you go back to those days when you started your career, is there any advice you'd give your younger self?
I learned a lot of valuable lessons. So the first lesson I learned is that I tried to meet my stakeholders' expectations. And I didn't realize that that wasn't my job as a CISO. My job as a CISO was to manage stakeholder expectations. And so I acted like the subject matter expert. The problem with that is that when you force people into decisions because you're the subject matter expert, those decisions are not binding. They don't withstand the test of time. And so the decisions came undone. I lost half my budget simply because I thought I had agreement, but it was really me pushing it and not letting the senior stakeholders make their decision and driving to consensus. So I learned that a CISO has to be a facilitator, and a facilitator has to be neutral. You have to be unbiased to be an effective facilitator. So driving consensus is more important than getting a decision that's driven by a subject matter expert and somewhat independent. So that was a really valuable lesson that I've learned. And today I think it's a differentiator. I think any CISO today that's successful has learned, maybe the hard way like me, how to drive consensus across business stakeholders.
I couldn't agree more, and we're still learning that as CISOs, because not most of us come from a technical background, and we think being technical is the winning game, but no, really it's like communication and education and bringing people along on the journey, right? So
that's exactly right. And there's not a lot of opportunity to practice this skill set unless you're a BISO. And it's what makes BISOs, I think, so valuable is they get to practice some of these skills that you don't get an opportunity to do. And I don't know how else to learn if you don't practice and make mistakes and then adjust.
Yep. I love that. It's a great lesson to learn early.
Yeah.
Tell me one of your favorite analogies in explaining cybersecurity to non-technical people. people?
Yeah, I'd say the most is the David Letterman School of Cybersecurity. And you might say, well, what the heck is that? And that's the top 10. And Letterman has a wonderful way of always identifying the top 10, going from 10 to 1, right? And I think what I try to do is get stakeholders to understand that every organization has a different attack surface that has unique characteristics. And so what works for one enterprise doesn't necessarily work for another enterprise, and there's not a one-size-fits-all model to cybersecurity, despite the fact that we have standards, regulatory requirements, and cyber risk management frameworks that suggest there's one way to manage cybersecurity. And reality is every enterprise is a little bit different, and it requires basically to say, for this enterprise at this point in time, these are the top 10 cybersecurity risks, and I'm going to resource or allocate resources to the top risks and to the top, say 1 through 5, and the risks 5 through 10, they're going to be under-resourced. So I'm allocating scarce resource to the highest risk and then managing that as the risk changes. So I call it the David Letterman School of Information Security, but it's basically an acknowledgement that you can't do everything, and what the best allocation resource is to the highest risk. And if you can get your business stakeholders to come to consensus on that, then you can get the investments that are necessary. And there's some things that you're not going to do particularly well. That's life. And as long as the most important things are covered, that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, I might use that, the David Letterman analogy. I love it. What do you think are the biggest challenges in cloud security that are still misunderstood today?
So there's probably two things that come to mind right off the bat. The first is that, like any part of the enterprise, you have to understand what your assets are, and you have to understand how to configure those assets. So configuration management across third-party suppliers in the cloud world is harder than it sounds. It has a high degree of difficulty, but it has tremendous impact on the consistent approach from a cybersecurity standpoint. So that's like clearly number one. Number two is I'm a big believer in practicing incident response. So every time I've ever done a synthetic cyber incident and practice it, on a tabletop or something like that, I've learned something. I've never done that without learning something. There's something that everybody has an opportunity to learn. For cloud, you've got third parties that are part of the incident response process. And so if you don't practice that, and I mean with the cloud provider, then there's always assumptions that the cloud provider is making and the enterprise are making, and they're not realistic. And so working collaboratively together on practicing incident response is a cyber resilient behavior. And unfortunately, I think today, that behavior, if it's being exercised, is being done independently, where the cloud provider is doing their thing and the enterprise is doing their thing. And there's always the tendency in an incident when there's pressure is to point fingers. And the only way to diminish that is to practice together and practice that resilient behavior.
Yeah, it's so funny because a lot of times you work with engineers and they're like, well, why do you need a cloud security product for that? Like Amazon's got that or Google's got that. And you're like, no, they don't. And those tabletop exercises can help you uncover a lot of that, right? That like, okay, let's test this out and who owns what, right?
Right.
Yeah. Jim, tell me a little bit more about your thoughts on runtime security and how important that is.
So I think runtime security is actually becoming more important, and the use of generative AI by threat actors is driving part of that, and the use of just a higher degree of automation and the concentration of technology that's embedded in all our lives today. All of that is kind of combining to cause this, a different paradigm, if you will. And runtime controls suggests that you have an immune system for the enterprise. And that immune system is going to be triggered automatically without a human having to initiate it. Just like antibodies in our immune system fight bacteria, your mind doesn't tell them to do that. It's just part of the immune system. It's the way it responds. And the same thing for an enterprise. We need an immune system that can respond and to react in real time. And that's becoming, the case today, but I think it's going to increase with AI going forward. So that, I like cyber resilient behaviors that are not dependent on a human triggering them. They're dependent on either data or models or large language models that are driving the response. And that response is in milliseconds. And that response doesn't take PTO, it happens all the time. And so I think a lot of our control design has to be moving towards real-time, preventative controls to deal with runtime security.
I love that. Two killer analogies to the immune system and Letterman. Last one for you. What's one thing, if you had to pick, that you think is going to be completely different 5 years from now when it relates to cloud security? And if you could if you had a magic wand, how would you go and fix it?
So I was a history major. And if I look back and look at the evolution of cloud capability, the biggest fundamental change to the enterprise is that software is built using cloud capability today. It's the normal way of assembling software today. And it means that cloud accounts are essential to building software. Well, a lot of our software security tool capability maturity is not necessarily aligned with using cloud accounts. And so we don't do a really good job protecting secrets or passwords to cloud accounts that are tied to the software supply chain, and it's why we're seeing weakness there. So that's today's problem. 5 years from now, software will be developed in a very different way than it's actually being developed today. And so it's another generational of change. And that, I think there's going to be two kinds of software developers. The software developers that use a large language model to generate code, and another category of software developers that are using generative AI to test the efficacy of their code, but they're writing it. And I think those are the only two that are going to be left. I think everybody else, not so much. I think those will be the two within 5 years. So I think software assembly and development is in for a radical change with generative AI. And I think we're going to see that in the next 4 or 5 years.
Amazing. Jim, thank you so much. So such an honor to do this with you. So I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.